Every decision you have ever made rests on something you never stopped to examine. When you chose a career, you assumed some lives go better than others. When you voted, you assumed some outcomes matter more than alternative ones. When you told a friend they deserved better, you assumed deserving was real. These assumptions are not optional decorations layered on top of rational thought. They are the load-bearing walls of every argument you have ever accepted. Axiology is the branch of philosophy that puts those walls under direct inspection. It asks what makes anything good, bad, better, or worse. And it means those words seriously. Not as shorthand for personal taste, not as cultural habit, but as claims about reality. And the moment you try to answer that question with any precision, the ground shifts. Because the obvious answers collapse under scrutiny, one after another, in predictable ways. Pleasure seems like the obvious foundation for goodness until you test it carefully. Getting what you want seems like the obvious measure of a life until you look at the edges. And listing the things that objectively matter opens a problem no list can easily close. What follows is the full architecture of that inquiry, from its most basic question to its deepest unresolved tensions. We will build each position from the problem that demanded it, test each answer against its strongest objections, and track the real consequences of getting this wrong. Because this is not an abstract exercise. The theory of value you hold, whether you know it or not, shapes everything downstream. Part 1. The question beneath every question. A hospital has one available kidney and 2 patients who will die without it. One is 30 years old with 2 children. The other is 65 and alone, but spent decades training surgeons who saved thousands of lives. The transplant committee has to choose, and they cannot flip a coin. The moment they begin deliberating, they are doing axiology, whether they use the word or not. If they give the kidney to the younger patient because more years of life is better, they have adopted a specific theory of what makes a life go well. If they give it to the older patient because past contributions to human welfare carry weight, they have adopted a different one. If they refuse to compare the 2 lives at all, calling them equally worthy, that too is a position about value. And here is what matters. They cannot avoid the question by refusing to answer it. Inaction is itself a choice, and it rests on the same hidden assumptions about what counts as good. The kidney will go somewhere, or it will go to neither, and every path assumes a framework for mattering. The committee might wish for a formula, but no formula can work until someone decides what goes into it. This is the situation axiology addresses at its most general level. Every ethical argument, every policy debate, every personal choice about how to spend a life presupposes some answer to a prior question. That prior question is, what is good and what makes it good? Ethics asks what we ought to do, but axiology asks the question that comes before that. Think of it this way. A doctor asks which treatment to prescribe, but that question only makes sense once you know what counts as getting better. Is getting better the absence of pain, or the presence of function, or the patient's own satisfaction with their condition? Those are 3 different answers, and they lead to 3 different prescriptions. The same structure operates everywhere invisibly. When an economist measures national progress using gross domestic product, that is a value claim in disguise. It says that the total monetary value of goods and services produced is the right proxy for how well a society is doing. When a different economist argues for measuring life satisfaction surveys instead, that is a rival value claim. Neither measurement is neutral. Each one encodes a theory about what makes things go well for people, and the theory is doing the real work. So the question is old, and it is also urgent. What is genuinely good? Not just good for me right now, but good in the sense that grounds all our judgments about better and worse. The first serious answer is also the simplest, and we turn to it next. Part 2. The simplest answer. Start with what seems undeniable. Pain is bad. Not bad in a complicated, qualified, contextual way, but bad directly, in a way you grasp from the inside without any argument. A child touches a hot stove and pulls her hand back, and no philosopher needs to explain to her that the experience was negative. She knows, and she knows, because the badness was in the experience itself. Now notice the mirror image. Pleasure, broadly understood, seems just as directly good. The warmth of sunlight on skin after a cold swim, the relief when chronic pain finally stops, the satisfaction of finishing difficult work you care about. These experiences carry their value on their face, requiring no external justification. The simplest theory of value takes these 2 observations and makes them the whole story. Hedonism, in the philosophical sense, says that pleasure is the only thing that is good in itself, and pain is the only thing that is bad in itself. Everything else we call good, money, health, friendship, knowledge, is good only because and only to the degree that it produces pleasure or prevents pain. Everything we call bad is bad only because it causes suffering or blocks enjoyment. This is not the same as saying people should be selfish or chase shallow thrills. The philosopher Jeremy Bentham, writing in the late 1700s, built an entire moral and legal philosophy on this foundation. He argued that the right action is whichever one produces the greatest total pleasure minus pain for everyone affected. The hedonism here is not about indulgence, but about a specific metaphysical claim, that the only thing with final value is conscious experience of a certain quality. And the claim has real appeal. Think about why you value anything at all, and keep asking why until you hit bottom. Why is money good? Because it lets you buy things. Why are those things good? Because they make life more comfortable or enjoyable or less painful. Why is comfort good? At some point, the hedonist says, you arrive at an experience, and you cannot push the question any further. The experience of pleasure just is where the chain of reasons terminates. You do not want pleasure for the sake of something else. Bentham's successor, John Stuart Mill, added a refinement in the mid-1800s that many people find compelling. Mill argued that pleasures differ not only in quantity, but in quality. The pleasure of solving a mathematical proof is not just more intense than the pleasure of eating candy. It is a different and higher kind of pleasure, one that anyone who has experienced both would prefer. Mill defended this with a famous test. If people who have experienced both kinds of pleasure reliably prefer one, that preference reveals its superior quality. This move let hedonism absorb a common objection. Critics often say that hedonism reduces the good life to mere sensation, to a pig wallowing in simple satisfaction. Mill's response was that the satisfied pig and the dissatisfied philosopher are not even in the same category of experience. A human being with a rich inner life who experiences refined pleasures is living better on hedonist grounds than a creature with abundant but shallow satisfactions. So hedonism has this going for it, a clear answer, grounded in something everyone can verify from their own first-person experience. Pain is bad, and everyone who has felt it agrees. Pleasure is good, and no one needs a theory to tell them so. The elegance is real. But then a philosopher named Robert Nozick in 1974 proposed a single thought experiment that put the entire framework under unbearable pressure. Part 3. The Experience Machine. Nozick asked you to consider a machine. Neuroscientists have built a device that can stimulate your brain to produce any experience you choose. You want to feel the triumph of writing a great novel? The device delivers exactly that experience. You want the warmth of deep friendship, the joy of discovery, the thrill of adventure? It delivers all of them perfectly. From the inside, you cannot tell the difference between the simulated experience and the real thing. The simulation is flawless. There is one condition. Once you plug in, you stay in for life, floating in a tank, unaware that any of it is artificial. You will never know the experiences are simulated. You will have every good feeling a human life can contain, with none of the real-world risk, failure, or loss. Nozick's question was simple. Would you plug in? If hedonism is right, you should, because the machine delivers the maximum possible balance of pleasure over pain. By hedonist logic, there is no rational reason to refuse. The experiences inside the machine are identical in quality to real ones. So, if the only thing that matters is how your life feels from the inside, the machine is the best life available. And yet, most people, when they think carefully about this, do not want to plug in. Nozick himself identified 3 reasons this reluctance makes sense. First, we want to actually do things, not just have the experience of doing them. Writing a real novel and having the feeling of writing one are not the same, and the difference matters to us. Second, we want to be a certain kind of person, to have real character formed by real choices, not a passive blob floating in a tank. Third, we want contact with reality, with the actual texture of a world that exists independently of our nervous system. Now, here is where the argument bites hardest. If you agree that you would not plug in, then you have admitted that something other than pleasure matters to you. You have conceded that the quality of your experience is not the only thing that determines how well your life is going, and that means hedonism, as a complete theory of value, is wrong. This thought experiment operated at the level of pure philosophical argument for decades. But now consider something that has brought it uncomfortably close to daily life. Social media platforms are designed to maximize engagement, which is a proxy for maximizing a particular kind of pleasurable experience. The small burst of dopamine from a notification, a like, a new follower. Users report that hours spent on these platforms often feel good in the moment by moment, yet leave them feeling that something went wrong with their day. The hedonic content was positive, but the overall assessment of the time spent is negative. People sense that their experience was real in the narrow neurochemical sense, but disconnected from anything they actually value. That gap between feeling good and doing well is exactly what Nozick's machine was designed to expose. And the exposure forces a question that hedonism cannot answer on its own terms. If pleasure is not the whole story, what else belongs in the account of a good life? The next candidate theory starts from a completely different foundation. Part 4. Getting what you want. The experience machine showed that pleasure is not enough, but it also revealed something positive. One of the reasons people refuse to plug in is that they want their real desires to be actually satisfied in the real world. Not just the feeling of satisfaction, but the fact of it. The novelist wants her book to actually exist on shelves, not just to feel as though it does. This observation points toward a different theory of value, one that puts desire at the center. Desire satisfaction theory says your life goes well to the extent that your desires are fulfilled, and badly to the extent that they are frustrated. What counts as good for you is determined by what you actually want, and because different people want different things, the theory automatically respects individual differences in a way hedonism struggles to. The appeal is immediate and democratic. No external authority gets to tell you that your values are wrong or your preferences are confused. You want to climb mountains, and I want to play cello, and the theory says both lives go well when we each get what we want. There is no imposed ranking of pleasures, no philosopher deciding whose satisfactions count as higher or lower. And the theory elegantly handles the experience machine problem. If your desire is to actually write a great novel, and writing means producing a real book in the real world, then the machine cannot satisfy that desire. You want the world to be a certain way, not just to feel as though it is. So the machine fails on desire theory grounds, even though it succeeds on hedonist grounds. Desire satisfaction theory also has deep roots in how modern institutions actually work. When economists build models of rational choice, they typically define welfare in terms of preference satisfaction. A consumer is better off when she gets more of what she prefers. Policy is evaluated by whether it moves people closer to satisfying their revealed preferences. When your government measures whether a trade deal is good, it is often asking whether consumers can now get more of what they want at lower cost. That entire framework rests on desire satisfaction theory, usually without naming it. The theory also captures something about the moral weight of autonomy. Telling someone that their desires are irrelevant to their own well-being feels paternalistic in a way that most people rightly resist. If a patient refuses a treatment that a doctor knows would reduce pain, desire theory says the patient's own wishes determine what counts as a good outcome for her. Hedonism would say the doctor knows better, because more pleasure is objectively better, regardless of what the patient wants. So desire satisfaction theory avoids the experience machine, respects autonomy, and matches the logic of our most powerful social institutions. It seems like a serious upgrade. But the theory has a vulnerability that shows up the moment you examine which desires actually count. Part 5. The Wrong Desires. A man raised in a community that told him his only purpose was to serve a local leader spends his entire life fulfilling that role. He desires to serve, he does serve, and his desire is satisfied. By the strict logic of desire satisfaction theory, his life is going well. His wants are being met. But something has gone deeply wrong here, and you can feel it. His desire was not freely formed. It was installed in him by circumstances designed to benefit someone else at his expense. He never had the information or the freedom to develop the desires he would have formed under better conditions. His satisfied desires are not evidence that his life is going well. They are evidence that his capacity to want better things was damaged before it could develop. This is the problem of adaptive preferences, and it strikes at the foundation of desire theory. People systematically adjust their wants downward to match their circumstances. A woman denied access to education stops wanting education. A prisoner who has spent decades in solitary confinement stops wanting human contact. Their desires are satisfied, or at least not frustrated, but calling their lives good for that reason seems like a cruel mistake. The economist and philosopher Amartya Sen pressed this objection with devastating examples from development economics. He showed that in regions with extreme gender inequality, women often report being satisfied with conditions that objectively limit their health, freedom, and opportunity. Their reported desires have been shaped by deprivation to match what deprivation allows. A theory that takes those adapted desires at face value cannot distinguish between a person who is content and a person who has been broken into contentment. But adaptive preferences are not the only problem. There is also the problem of uninformed desires. A person might desire a career in a field she has completely wrong beliefs about. She thinks being a trial lawyer means making passionate speeches, when actually it means years of document review in windowless rooms. If she gets the career and it satisfies the desire she actually had, but the desire was based on a false picture of reality, has her life gone well? The desire was satisfied, but only because she did not know what she was wanting. And then there are desires that are simply self-destructive. An addicted person desires the substance that is destroying his body and his relationships. Each hit satisfies a desire, and the theory, taken at face value, scores that as a gain for his well-being. That result is absurd, and most people recognize it as absurd immediately. Defenders of desire theory have a standard response to all three of these problems. They move from actual desires to idealized desires, saying that what matters is not what you happen to want, but what you would want if you were fully informed, free from manipulation, and thinking clearly. Your ideal self, the version of you with complete information and no distortions, is the one whose desires count. The addicted person's ideal self would not desire the substance, so the addiction does not contribute to well-being. This move solves the obvious cases, but it opens a deeper problem. Once you start specifying the conditions under which desires count, you are no longer letting desire do the real work. You are smuggling in a prior standard of what counts as a good desire, and that standard, whatever it is doing the heavy lifting, not the desire itself. If you say the desire must be informed, you are saying that truth matters independently of desire. If you say it must be free, you are saying that autonomy matters independently of desire. The theory that was supposed to ground value in what people want now depends on values that people might not want at all. It is pulling itself up by its own bootstraps. So pleasure alone is not enough, and desire alone is not enough. Both theories ground value in the subject, in what a person experiences or wants. The failures of both point toward a possibility that many people find uncomfortable. Maybe some things are good for you, whether you feel them, want them, or even know about them. Part 6. Value without the valuer. Here is the uncomfortable move. A person lives a long life filled with genuine pleasure and completely satisfied desires. She enjoyed every day, got everything she wanted, and never felt a moment of frustration. But she never had a single real friendship, never learned anything true about the world, and never accomplished anything of substance. Her pleasures came from trivial amusements, and her desires were all for trivial things. She spent 50 years contentedly counting blades of grass. If that description makes you think something is missing from her life, even though she was happy and satisfied, then you are already sympathetic to the third major theory of well-being. Objectivist theories hold that certain things are good for a person regardless of whether that person enjoys them or wants them. Knowledge, deep personal relationships, meaningful achievement and health are on the list not because people happen to desire them, but because they are genuine components of a life going well. The philosopher Derek Parfit, writing in 1984, laid out the landscape cleanly. He identified 3 families of theories about well-being: hedonist theories, desire-based theories, and what he called objectivist theories. The first 2 locate value entirely in the mental life of the subject. The third says that the subject's mental life is not the whole story. The initial resistance to this view is strong and understandable. It sounds paternalistic, like a philosopher telling people what should matter to them regardless of what they care about. A person who despises socializing is told that friendship is objectively good for him. A person who finds intellectual life tedious is told that knowledge belongs on the list of things that would make her life better. Who gets to write this list, and by what authority? That objection has real force, but consider the reverse. Think about a brilliant scientist in the early stages of a neurodegenerative disease who does not yet know she is ill. She is losing her capacity for the complex thought that defined her life's work, and she feels fine. Her pleasures are intact, her desires are being satisfied, and she has no awareness that anything is wrong. But something is wrong. She is losing something that matters, something that was constitutive of her flourishing as a person, even though she does not feel the loss. If you agree that the scientist is worse off, even though she does not know it, you are agreeing that well-being is not fully determined by subjective states. Something objective is contributing to or detracting from how well her life is going. And this is exactly what objectivist theories claim. Modern versions of these theories typically draw from the philosophical tradition going back to Aristotle. Aristotle argued that human well-being consists in the excellent exercise of distinctly human capacities: reason, social connection, practical wisdom, and creative activity. The contemporary philosopher Martha Nussbaum developed a specific list of central human capabilities, including life, health, bodily integrity, the use of imagination and thought, emotional attachment, practical reason, affiliation with others, connection with nature, play, and control over one's environment. Her list was designed to serve as a foundation for development policy, a way of measuring whether societies are providing their members with the conditions for genuine flourishing. But the objection about authority does not go away simply because the list sounds reasonable. Different cultures, different individuals, and different philosophical traditions would produce different lists. Who adjudicates when the lists conflict? And what grounds the list itself, if not pleasure or desire? The list theorist typically says that the items are grounded in human nature, in what beings like us need in order to flourish. But that answer immediately runs into one of the deepest problems in all of philosophy: the apparent gap between facts about what is and claims about what ought to be. Part 7. The gap between is and ought. A biologist studying bonobos discovers that these primates share food with strangers, a behavior that costs them resources and provides no obvious genetic benefit. A journalist writes the headline, "Nature shows us that generosity is good." That headline contains a logical error so fundamental that it has shaped the entire trajectory of moral philosophy. The biologist discovered a fact about primate behavior. The journalist extracted a moral conclusion from that fact. And between the two, there is a gap that no amount of additional factual information can close. The philosopher David Hume identified this gap in 1739 in a passage that became one of the most discussed paragraphs in the history of ethics. He noticed that writers on morality would describe facts about human nature, about God, about the world, and then suddenly shift from sentences using the word is to sentences using the word ought, without explaining how they got from one to the other. The shift seemed invisible, Hume said, but it was the most consequential move in the entire argument. The point is not merely about grammar. It is about the logical structure of reasoning itself. From the fact that human beings evolved to cooperate, nothing follows about whether cooperation is good. From the fact that a chemical produces pleasure in the brain, nothing follows about whether we ought to pursue that pleasure. From the fact that every culture in human history has practiced some form of hierarchy, nothing follows about whether hierarchy is justified. Facts describe how the world is, and values prescribe how it should be, and you cannot get from one to the other by description alone. This matters directly for the theories of value we have been examining. The objectivist theorist, who says health, knowledge, and friendship are good for humans, because human nature requires them for flourishing, is making exactly the move Hume flagged. They are observing facts about human biology and psychology and extracting a prescription about how lives should go. But the gap between what humans are like and what is good for them is the same gap Hume identified, and it remains open. You can see this gap operating in real-world arguments constantly, once you know to look for it. When someone argues that a particular family structure is natural and therefore good, they are leaping the gap. When someone argues that competition is hardwired into human beings and therefore free market capitalism is the right economic system, they are leaping the gap. When someone argues that human beings are naturally empathetic and therefore we should build generous welfare states, they are leaping it too. Every side of every political debate makes this move, and every time the logic fails in exactly the same way. Now, some philosophers have tried to bridge the gap, and their attempts are serious. The philosopher Philippa Foot argued that evaluative judgments about living things are grounded in facts about what those organisms need to function well as the kind of thing they are. A good oak tree has deep roots and broad leaves, and this is both a factual and an evaluative claim simultaneously. Similarly, she argued, a good human life involves the exercise of practical rationality, and this evaluation is grounded in the natural facts about what humans are. Whether this actually bridges the gap or merely disguises, it remains genuinely contested. Critics point out that evaluating an oak tree as good or bad is different from evaluating a human life, because trees do not choose their own values. The fact that humans have the capacity for rational thought does not by itself tell us that exercising that capacity is good. You still need a value judgment to get from the capacity to the prescription, and that judgment is the gap reasserting itself. So we are left with a real tension. Value seems to require some grounding in the world, some facts about what beings like us are and need, but the purely factual can never, on its own, generate an evaluative conclusion. A different philosopher, working at the beginning of the 20th century, pushed this tension even further. He argued that goodness itself is a property so strange that it resists analysis altogether. Part 8. The Open Question. Every attempt so far to say what goodness is has followed the same strategy. Goodness is pleasure. Goodness is the satisfaction of desire. Goodness is whatever belongs on the correct list of human needs. Each of these tries to identify goodness with something else, something we can observe, measure, or define. The British philosopher G.E. Moore, writing in 1903, argued that every attempt of this kind must fail, and he had a single argument to show why. Take the hedonist claim that good just means pleasant. If that definition were correct, then saying pleasure is good would be the same as saying pleasure is pleasant. That second sentence is a tautology, a trivially empty statement that tells you nothing new. But the first sentence, pleasure is good, clearly says something substantial. It makes a claim that a reasonable person could question or deny. A person could coherently say, I agree this is pleasant, but is it good? And that question would not be confused or meaningless. Moore argued that this test applies to every proposed definition of good, not just the hedonist one. You can ask, I see that this satisfies desires, but is it good? And the question is genuinely open. You can ask, I see that this appears on the list of things humans need for flourishing, but is it good? And that question is open too. No matter what property you try to substitute for goodness, you can always meaningfully ask whether something with that property is truly good. And that persistent openness shows that goodness is not identical to any of those properties. Moore concluded that goodness is a simple, unanalyzable property, something real but impossible to break down into component parts. He compared it to the color yellow. You can describe the wavelength of light that produces the experience of yellow, but that physical description is not what yellowness is. Yellowness is something you grasp directly through perception, not through definition. Moore claimed goodness works the same way. You recognize it when you encounter it, but you cannot define it in terms of anything else. This argument has a name, the open question argument, and it has generated over a century of fierce debate. The most important objection came from the philosopher William Frankena, who argued that Moore assumes the very thing he is trying to prove. If goodness really is pleasure, then asking whether pleasure is good is like asking whether water is water. The question only seems open if you have already decided that the two are not the same. Moore, Frankena charged, begs the question by treating the openness of the question as evidence, when that openness is only there if his conclusion is already correct. Later, philosophers tried to rescue the core insight while dropping Moore's specific conclusions. Some argued that moral concepts like goodness have a special motivational force that no purely descriptive concept shares. When you call something good, you are not just describing it. You are endorsing it, committing yourself to caring about it in a way that mere factual description never does. A person can learn every physical fact about a situation and still ask, genuinely, whether it is good, because goodness is not another physical fact to be discovered, it is an evaluation to be made. But this response has its own cost. If goodness is not identical to any natural property, then where does it come from? If it is not part of the physical world the way atoms and wavelengths are, how do we know about it? Moore said we know it through a kind of direct moral intuition, but that answer raises as many problems as it solves. People's moral intuitions conflict, and there is no obvious way to resolve those conflicts by appeal to further intuition. The open question argument successfully blocks easy definitions of goodness, but it leaves us without a clear account of what goodness actually is. That unresolved tension between goodness as a real property and goodness as something undefinable shapes the next problem we need to address. Before asking again what is good, we need to ask a more structural question. How do different kinds of value relate to each other? Part 9. Intrinsic and Instrumental. $100 bill is sitting on a table. Ask why it is valuable, and the answer is obvious. Because of what you can exchange it for. Its value is entirely borrowed from the things it can buy. If every store in the world closed permanently and no one would ever accept paper currency again, the bill would be worth nothing beyond the cotton and linen fibers it is printed on. Now consider the experience of listening to a piece of music that moves you deeply. Ask why that experience is valuable, and you hit a different kind of answer. It is not valuable because it leads to something else. It is not a means to a further end. The experience carries its value in itself, right there in the listening. You would not say the music was worthwhile, because of what it produced afterward. This contrast marks one of the most fundamental distinctions in all of axiology, the difference between instrumental value and intrinsic value. Something has instrumental value when it is good as a means to something else. Something has intrinsic value when it is good in itself, for its own sake, independent of what it leads to. Money is the standard example of the first, and the theories we have been examining all try to identify what belongs in the second category. Hedonism says only pleasure has intrinsic value. Desire theory says only desire satisfaction has it. Objectivist theories say several things have it: knowledge, friendship, achievement, and so on. But all three agree that the distinction itself is real, and that the question of what holds intrinsic value is the central question of axiology. The distinction seems clear enough in those clean cases, but it starts to blur the moment you apply pressure. Consider health. Is health intrinsically good, or is it instrumentally good because it enables you to do the things that are intrinsically good? A strict hedonist says health is only instrumentally good, valuable only because it prevents pain and enables pleasure. But someone in perfect health who reflects on their condition often reports that health feels like a good in itself, not just a ticket to other goods. The philosopher Christine Korsgaard drew a distinction that helps clarify this tangle. She separated intrinsic value, the value something has because of its internal properties, from what she called final value, the value something has when it is valued for its own sake rather than as a means. These can come apart. A national flag might have final value for a patriot who values it for its own sake, not as a means to anything else, even though its intrinsic properties, a piece of coloured cloth, do not seem to contain that value. The value is final, but not intrinsic in Korsgaard's sense, because it depends on a relationship between the flag and a community, not just on the flag's own properties. This distinction matters because it reveals a hidden assumption in much of value theory. When philosophers ask what has intrinsic value, they often really mean what has final value, what is worth pursuing for its own sake. But these are two different questions, and conflating them leads to confusion. Friendship might be valued for its own sake, giving it final value, but its value might also depend partly on the kind of beings that friends are, which makes its value partly relational rather than purely intrinsic. There is another category that complicates the picture even further. Some things have contributory value, meaning they are valuable as parts of a larger whole that is itself valuable. A single note in a symphony has no significant value on its own, but as part of a larger structure, it contributes to something that has great final value. Remove the note, and the whole is diminished. The note's value is neither purely instrumental, since it is not a means to the symphony, but a constituent of it, nor purely intrinsic, since it depends on its place in the larger structure. Moore himself recognized this with a principle he called organic unities. The value of a whole, he argued, need not equal the sum of the values of its parts. A beautiful painting and the pleasure of viewing it together form a whole that is more valuable than either one alone, and more valuable than their values simply added together. The combination creates something new that neither component possesses in isolation. These complications are not merely academic hair-splitting. They matter for every practical question about how to organize a society or a life. If you think only pleasure has final value, then every institution should be designed to maximize pleasure. If you think knowledge has contributory value as part of a good life, then you should fund education even when it does not directly increase anyone's felt happiness. If organic unities are real, then a life that combines modest goods in the right structure might be more valuable than one that maximizes a single good. The architecture of value, how different kinds of value relate and combine, determines what a rational person should pursue. But the existence of multiple kinds of value and multiple things that might possess those kinds raises a question the simple theories could avoid. What happens when genuine values pull in opposite directions and cannot all be satisfied at once? Part 10. The Architecture of Mattering. Before we get to the collision of values, we need to see clearly how values are structured in any given life or institution. Because the relationship between values is not flat, and understanding the hierarchy changes everything about practical decision-making. Consider a physician deciding how to spend her time. She values her patient's health, her own professional competence, her family relationships, and her scientific curiosity. None of these values is merely a means to the others. She does not love her children because it makes her a better doctor, and she does not practice medicine because it makes her a better mother. Each of these is valued for its own sake, but they are not all valued in the same way, and they do not all contribute to her life in the same manner. Some of her values are constitutive of her identity. Being a good physician is not something she does. It is part of who she is. Other values are enabling conditions that make her central pursuits possible. Financial stability lets her practice medicine without desperation, but no one would describe her life as primarily about earning money. Still, other values are what the philosopher Joseph Raz called comprehensive goods, large-scale pursuits that organize many smaller goods into a coherent structure. Her medical career is a comprehensive good that gives meaning to individual actions like studying, diagnosing, and staying late at the hospital. Actions that would have less value in isolation. This layered structure appears everywhere, not just in individual lives. A university values truth, free inquiry, student development, and institutional survival. These values are not interchangeable, and they do not reduce to a single metric. The university does not pursue student development as a means to institutional survival, nor does it pursue truth merely as a means to student development. Each value has its own standing, but they form a structured whole, and when the structure is right, the institution works. When the structure breaks, when institutional survival begins to override the pursuit of truth, everyone recognizes the corruption, even if they cannot articulate the axiological principle being violated. The philosopher Elizabeth Anderson made a powerful observation about this structure in the late 1990s. She argued that different goods properly call for different kinds of valuation, not just different amounts of the same valuation. The way you should value a friendship is categorically different from the way you should value a useful tool. To value a friend the way you value a tool, as a means to your ends, replaceable when a better option appears, is not merely to undervalue the friendship. It is to relate to it in the wrong mode entirely. The error is qualitative, not quantitative. Anderson called this the expressive theory of rational action. Rational choice is not just about getting the most of what you want. It is about expressing the right attitudes toward the things that have value in your life. A parent who calculated the monetary cost of time spent with their child against the hourly wage they could earn at work is not just making a mathematical error. They are expressing an attitude toward their child that is incompatible with what parental love actually requires. The categories of valuation matter, and collapsing them into a single scale destroys something real. This point connects directly to debates about policy that affect millions of lives. Cost-benefit analysis, as practiced by governments and corporations, assigns dollar values to outcomes, including human lives, environmental goods, and cultural heritage. A regulator might calculate that the value of a statistical life is roughly $10 million, and then decide whether a safety regulation is worth its cost based on that number. The framework assumes that all values can be placed on a single monetary scale and compared. Anderson's analysis explains why this practice, despite its usefulness, triggers deep unease. It is not just that the numbers might be wrong. It is that translating certain goods into monetary terms changes the mode of valuation itself. A human life valued in dollars is not being valued less than it should be. It is being valued in a way that fails to express what a human life actually warrants: respect, dignity, moral concern, none of which are denominated in currency. The architecture of mattering, then, is not just about what is valuable, but about how each valuable thing calls to be valued. And that architecture becomes most visible and most strained when different values of fundamentally different kinds demand things that cannot all be given at once. Part 11. When values collide. A municipal government must decide whether to demolish a historic neighborhood to build affordable housing. The neighborhood contains buildings of genuine cultural and architectural significance. The housing shortage causes real suffering. Families are overcrowded, rents consume most of working incomes, and some people are living in cars. Both the cultural heritage and the relief of human suffering are real values, and in this case, fully honoring one means significantly sacrificing the other. If all values could be reduced to a single underlying quantity, this conflict would be difficult, but not theoretically troubling. You would measure the total amount of that quantity each option produces, choose the larger number, and move on. But the whole development of axiology up to this point suggests that the values at stake here are not reducible to a common unit. The historical significance of a building and the relief of a family's housing crisis are not two amounts of the same stuff. The philosopher Isaiah Berlin, writing at the middle of the 20th century, made this the centerpiece of his political philosophy. Berlin argued that the deepest and most consequential values humans hold, liberty, equality, justice, beauty, knowledge, are genuinely plural and genuinely irreducible to one another. There is no master value that subsumes all others, and there is no common scale on which they can all be weighed. When they conflict, as they inevitably do, the conflict is real and sometimes tragic, meaning that something genuinely valuable will be lost no matter what you choose. This position is called value pluralism, and its implications are severe. If Berlin is right, then the dream of a single correct ranking of all values, a final answer to every moral dilemma, is not just unrealized, but unrealizable in principle. There will always be situations where a reasonable, well-informed person faces a choice between goods that cannot be compared on a single scale. The technical term for this is incommensurability. Two values are incommensurable when neither is greater than, less than, or equal to the other in value. To feel the force of incommensurability, consider a more personal case. A talented cellist is offered a place in a prestigious orchestra, which requires relocating across the world. She also has an aging parent whose health is declining and who needs her nearby. The musical career and the filial care are both genuinely important, and choosing one means losing something real and irreplaceable in the other. The cellist cannot say that the career is worth exactly 1.3 units of filial devotion, and therefore she should go. The values do not translate into the same terms. The philosopher Ruth Chang has argued that incommensurability does not mean the values are simply unrelated. She proposes a fourth value relation beyond better than, worse than, and equal. She calls it being on a par. Two options are on a par when there is a positive value relation between them, but it is not any of the standard three. They are in the same evaluative neighborhood, close enough to be genuine competitors, but without a precise ranking. Chang argues that when we face choices between items that are on a par, we exercise a distinctive kind of agency. We commit to one path and thereby create reasons for that path rather than discovering pre-existing reasons. Whether or not Chang's solution works, the phenomenon she identifies is real and pervasive. Every hospital triage decision involves weighing incommensurable values. Every national budget involves trading culture against security, against welfare, against infrastructure. Every parent who works long hours to provide for a family is trading one kind of good against another kind that does not convert. Berlin drew a strong political conclusion from value pluralism. If genuine values conflict and there is no master ranking, then any political system that claims to have discovered the single correct way to organize human life is mistaken and probably dangerous. Totalitarian ideologies promise that all good things go together, that freedom, equality, prosperity and virtue can all be maximized at once if only the right system is implemented. Berlin argued that this promise is not just false, but incoherent because the values themselves resist unification. But pluralism has its own problems that remain genuinely unresolved. If values are truly incommensurable, how do we ever make rational choices between them? If there is no common measure, does that mean every decision between competing values is arbitrary? Pluralists insist that practical wisdom, judgment, and sensitivity to context allow reasonable choices without a formula. Critics respond that without a formula, or at least a principle, we have no way to distinguish a wise choice from a rationalized preference. The debate between those who seek a unified theory of value and those who insist on irreducible plurality is among the oldest and most active in all of philosophy, and it remains open. That openness takes us to the next question. If values are multiple and sometimes impossible to compare, is there any way to measure and aggregate them at all? Part 12. Can value be measured? The previous parts revealed that values are plural, structured, and sometimes impossible to rank. But the practical world does not wait for philosophers to resolve these tensions. Governments must allocate budgets, hospitals must triage patients, and individuals must decide how to spend the one life they have. All of these activities implicitly assume that value can be measured, at least well enough to guide action. The question is whether that assumption can withstand scrutiny. To measure something, you need a unit, and the unit must remain constant across cases. A meter is a meter, whether you are measuring a bridge in Tokyo or a hallway in Paris. For value measurement to work, you would need something analogous, a stable unit of goodness that applies everywhere. The classical utilitarian tradition tried to provide exactly this. Bentham proposed what he called a felicific calculus, a method for computing the total pleasure and pain produced by any action. You would assess each pleasure along 7 dimensions: its intensity, duration, certainty, how soon it arrives, how likely it is to lead to further pleasures, how likely it is to be mixed with pain, and how many people are affected. Add it all up, subtract the pains, and the action with the highest net score is the right one. The ambition is clear, and the appeal to anyone who has had to make difficult allocation decisions is obvious. But every dimension Bentham listed presents its own measurement problem. How do you compare the intensity of your relief at a medical diagnosis with the intensity of my delight at a piece of music? Not in your own subjective estimation of both, but as they actually are for each of us from the inside. This is the problem of interpersonal comparison, and it remains one of the hardest problems in the theory of value. You can measure your own pleasures against each other, roughly, by introspection. You know that the pleasure of a hot meal after a cold day is greater than the pleasure of finding a coin on the sidewalk. But comparing your pleasure to mine requires a standpoint that neither of us occupies, a view from outside both our experiences simultaneously. Economists in the 20th century largely gave up on interpersonal comparison of subjective states and moved to a preference-based framework. Instead of measuring how much pleasure you feel, they measure what you would choose. If you choose A over B, you are said to prefer A, and that preference is taken as evidence that A has more value for you. Value becomes operationalized as revealed preference, and measurement becomes possible because choices are observable. But this move carries a cost that connects directly to the problems raised in Part 5. Revealed preference tells you what someone chose, not whether the choice was good for them. The person who chooses the addictive substance over the treatment reveals a preference, but that revelation says nothing about well-being. The framework abandoned the question of whether choices track genuine value and settled for tracking choices themselves. More recently, psychologists studying subjective well-being have tried to measure value through direct self-reports. People rate their life satisfaction on a scale of 1 to 10, or report their mood at random intervals throughout the day. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman drew a distinction between 2 kinds of well-being: experienced well-being, how you feel moment by moment, and evaluative well-being, how you judge your life when you step back and reflect. These 2 measures often come apart, sometimes dramatically. A person with a high income might report high life satisfaction, but not experience much day-to-day pleasure. A person caring for a sick relative might report low life satisfaction, but experience deep moments of meaning and connection. The gap between experienced and evaluative well-being is not a technical glitch to be fixed with better surveys. It reflects a genuine philosophical disagreement about what kind of value we should be measuring. And it forces a choice that no measurement tool can make for us. Are we trying to maximize how people feel or how they judge their own lives, or something else entirely that might not show up in either measure? The question of what to measure turns out to depend on the answer to the very question. Measurement was supposed to help us resolve. Part 13. Adding up the good. Even if we could measure individual values perfectly, a further problem awaits: how to aggregate them. Adding up value across people and across time is the foundation of every policy analysis, every cost-benefit calculation, and every utilitarian argument. And it turns out to be far more treacherous than it looks. Start with the simplest case. 2 people each have a headache, and you have 2 aspirin. Giving each person 1 aspirin seems straightforward. You are distributing a remedy that reduces suffering equally. The aggregation is simple addition. 1 unit of relief plus 1 unit of relief equals 2 units of total relief. Now change the case. You have enough resources to either give 1 person a life-saving surgery or give 1,000 people relief from mild back pain. If you add up the units of pain relief across the 1,000, the total might exceed the value of 1 saved life, depending on the numbers. Strict aggregation says you should help the 1,000 because the sum is larger. But most people balk at this conclusion. Saving a life seems categorically different from relieving mild discomfort, and no amount of headache relief seems like it should outweigh a death. The philosopher Thomas Scanlon pressed this kind of objection against simple aggregation. He argued that morality is not about maximizing the total sum of a value across all people. It is about finding principles that each individual could reasonably accept. And no individual facing death could reasonably accept a principle that sacrifices her life for the aggregate comfort of 1,000 others with minor aches. Scanlon's view reflects a deep tension in how we think about the relationship between individuals and groups. The philosopher John Rawls put this tension in sharp focus with a phrase that became a touchstone of political philosophy: the separateness of persons. Utilitarianism, Rawls argued, treats the boundary between one person and another as morally insignificant. It adds up welfare across people the way a single person might add up welfare across different moments of their own life. But people are not moments. Each person has their own life to live, their own perspective, and their own claim to fair treatment that cannot be dissolved into a collective sum. The practical stakes of this debate are enormous. When a government decides whether to fund cancer research or road repair, it is aggregating across different kinds of value, affecting different people in different ways. The standard tool for this is the quality-adjusted life year, a metric used in health economics that assigns a number between 0 and 1 to each year of life, depending on its quality, where 1 is perfect health and 0 is death. A treatment that gives someone 5 additional years at a quality of 0.8 scores 4 quality-adjusted life years. This metric makes aggregation possible, and it has guided billions of dollars in health policy. But it encodes specific axiological assumptions that are rarely examined. It assumes that a year of life at quality 0.5 is exactly worth half a year at quality 1. It assumes that the value of a life year is the same regardless of who lives it, rich or poor, young or old. It assumes that values can be traded off continuously with no thresholds or discontinuities. Every one of these assumptions is philosophically contestable, and changing any one of them would redirect resources to different people with different conditions. The deepest problem with aggregation, though, is not technical but structural. Aggregation requires that values be commensurable, that they can be placed on a single scale. But the work of Berlin, Chang, Anderson and others suggests that some of the most important values resist exactly this kind of reduction. If justice and mercy, liberty and equality, individual rights and collective welfare cannot be translated into a common currency, then no aggregation formula can properly weigh them against each other. This does not mean that aggregation is useless. It means that every aggregation framework smuggles in value judgments that the framework itself cannot justify. The numbers look precise, but the precision is borrowed from assumptions that are themselves deeply uncertain. Recognizing this changes what rational decision-making looks like, from confident calculation to something more like judgment under acknowledged ignorance. Part 14. Building value from scratch. Every theory we have considered so far assumes that value is something to be discovered. Hedonists discover that pleasure is good. Objective list theorists discover that knowledge and friendship are good. Even the philosophers who argued about the is-ought gap assumed there is a correct answer out there, even if we cannot derive it from facts alone. Constructivism rejects this entire framing. It says that values are not discovered, but constructed, built up from the activity of practical reasoning itself. There are right answers to moral and evaluative questions, but those answers are not waiting for us in the fabric of reality. They emerge from the process of reasoning correctly about what to do. To see why this position is attractive, return to the problem that ended Part 8. Moore showed that goodness cannot be identified with any natural property. The is-ought gap showed that no description of the world, however complete, entails a value judgment, and the objective list theorist could not explain where the authority of the list comes from without either appealing to facts, which falls to Hume, or to intuition, which lacks a method for resolving disagreement. Value seems to require a grounding that neither the natural world nor brute intuition can provide. The philosopher Christine Korsgaard, working in the tradition of Immanuel Kant, proposed a different foundation entirely. She argued that the source of normativity, the reason values have authority over us, is not some external fact about the universe, but the structure of rational agency itself. When you act, you must endorse some principle as your reason for acting. And to endorse a principle, you must treat yourself as the kind of being whose endorsement matters, a being with the authority to commit to reasons. This sounds abstract, so consider what it looks like in practice. A young lawyer is offered a bribe to suppress evidence that would exonerate an innocent defendant. She can take the money and no one will know. But when she deliberates, she cannot endorse the principle, take the money, without simultaneously undermining her own standing as someone whose deliberation means anything. If she acts on whatever impulse is strongest, she has stopped being an agent and become a puppet of circumstance. To act at all in a principled way, she must treat certain values as authoritative, and those values are constituted by the activity of reasoning itself. Kierkegaard called this procedural realism. There are correct answers to value questions because there are correct procedures for reasoning about them. The procedure is not arbitrary. It is built into the structure of what it means to be a rational agent who must decide what to do. You cannot opt out of valuing without opting out of agency, and you cannot opt out of agency while remaining a deliberating being. A different version of constructivism, developed by the philosopher Sharon Street, starts from a more modest premise. Street argued that evolution shaped our basic evaluative attitudes, our tendencies to care about survival, kin, fairness, and reciprocity. If moral realism were true, if values existed independently of our attitudes, it would be an extraordinary coincidence that evolution pushed our attitudes into alignment with those independent truths. There is no mechanism by which natural selection would track mind-independent moral facts. Street's conclusion was that moral truths are not independent of our evaluative attitudes, but are constituted by what follows from those attitudes when they are made fully coherent. On her view, the correct values for a given agent are whatever would survive the process of bringing all that agent's existing commitments into reflective equilibrium. This is a constructivist account because the values are built from the agent's own starting materials, not read off from an independent reality. But constructivism has a problem that cuts deep. If values are constructed from the activity of reasoning, what happens when a reasoning agent starts from vicious premises? Street acknowledged that on her view, a fully coherent agent who valued cruelty above all else would have genuine reasons to be cruel. There would be no standpoint outside their reasoning from which to say they were wrong. Kierkegaard resisted this conclusion, arguing that the structure of rational agency itself rules out such outcomes. But whether she succeeded is one of the most actively debated questions in contemporary metaethics. The worry is stark. If constructivism cannot guarantee that the outputs of correct reasoning are morally decent, then it either collapses into a sophisticated form of relativism or must smuggle in substantive values that it claimed to derive from procedure alone. That worry brings us to a view that embraces the darkest possible conclusion about value and argues that we should accept it. Part 15. The Error Theory. Every position in axiology so far has assumed that at least some value claims are true. Hedonists, desire theorists, objectivist theorists, and constructivists all disagree about what is good, but they agree that something is. In 1977, the philosopher J. L. Mackie published a book with a title that announced its conclusion: Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. His argument was that every positive moral and evaluative claim ever made is false. Not confused, not imprecise, not merely subjective, but flatly false, in the same way that claims about witches are false. People who say cruelty is wrong are making a claim about objective reality, and Mackie argued that nothing in objective reality corresponds to that claim. His first argument was from disagreement. The sheer scale and persistence of moral disagreement across cultures and centuries is a fact that demands explanation. If objective moral truths existed, you would expect convergence over time, the way scientific disagreements tend to resolve as evidence accumulates. But moral disagreements about justice, about sexual ethics, about the permissibility of killing in war, have not converged in any comparable way. Mackey argued that the best explanation is not that some cultures are morally blind, it is that there is nothing out there for anyone to see. His second argument was from what he called queerness. If objective moral values existed, they would be utterly unlike anything else in the physical universe. A moral fact would somehow have to be both a feature of reality and a command to act, simultaneously descriptive and prescriptive. Mackey pointed out that no other property in nature works this way. The mass of a rock does not tell you what to do with it. The temperature of a room does not obligate you to adjust the thermostat. But a moral fact, if it existed, would have to carry a built-in demand, what Mackey described as an intrinsic requirement to be pursued. Such a property, he argued, would be unlike anything else we have reason to believe exists. And our way of knowing such properties would be equally strange. If moral facts are not physical facts, then we cannot detect them through any of the senses or instruments that reveal the rest of the world to us. We would need some special faculty of moral perception, a kind of sixth sense for values, and no one has ever provided a credible account of how such a faculty would work or how it could have evolved. The argument from queerness gains force when you notice how often people talk about values as if they were features of the external world, projected outward like colour onto objects. You see a sunset and call it beautiful, and the beauty seems to be in the sunset, but the beauty is actually a response happening in your brain, projected onto the visual field. Mackey argued that moral properties work the same way. We project our emotional reactions onto the world and then mistake those projections for features of reality itself. The strongest responses to Mackey come from two directions. First, moral realists argue that the queerness objection proves too much. Mathematical truths are not physical objects either, but we do not conclude that mathematics is a mass delusion. If abstract truths can exist in mathematics without being physically weird, why not in ethics? Second, some philosophers argue that the disagreement Mackey emphasizes is overstated. At a deep enough level, they claim, there is substantial cross-cultural agreement about basic moral principles, and surface disagreements can be explained by differences in factual beliefs about the world rather than differences in fundamental values. Mackey was not unaware of these responses, and his position remains defensible even in the face of them. The mathematical analogy is imperfect because mathematical truths do not carry the motivational force that moral claims seem to require. And the claim of deep moral agreement is empirically contested and may reflect wishful thinking more than anthropological evidence. What makes the error theory genuinely unsettling is not just its conclusion, but the question it raises about what comes next. If every moral claim is false, should we abandon moral language entirely? Mackey himself did not think so. He argued that we should continue using moral concepts while understanding that they are human inventions, useful social tools that serve coordination and cooperation without being metaphysically grounded. This is a strange position, knowingly speaking a language you believe to be literally false, because the fiction is too useful to abandon. Whether that position is coherent is itself a live philosophical question. Part 16. Beauty and its demands. Axiology is not only about moral value. Some of the hardest questions about what matters and why arise in aesthetics, the study of beauty and artistic worth. And aesthetic value has features that resist every framework we have considered so far. Start with the fact that anyone who has stood before a great painting or heard a piece of music that stopped them mid-step knows firsthand. Aesthetic experience carries a peculiar authority. When a piece of music moves you deeply, the experience does not feel like a preference. The way choosing chocolate over vanilla is a preference. It feels like a recognition, as though the music is demanding your attention, and the demand is coming from outside you. The philosopher Immanuel Kant, writing in the late 1700s, identified this feature with precision in his Critique of Judgment. He argued that aesthetic judgments occupy a strange middle ground between subjective taste and objective fact. When you say, "This painting is beautiful," you are not just reporting that you happen to like it. You are making a claim that implicitly demands agreement from others. You expect that anyone with the right sensitivity and attention would see what you see. Yet you cannot prove your claim the way you can prove a mathematical theorem. Kant called this feature of aesthetic judgment subjective universality. The judgment is subjective because it is grounded in your experience, not in a measurable property of the object. But it is universal in its aspiration, because you treat it as something more than a mere personal reaction. You would not say, "This sunset is beautiful for me, but not for you." In the same casual way you would say, "Chocolate is tasty for me, but not for you." The beauty claim reaches for something that personal taste does not. This places aesthetic value in a peculiar position relative to the theories of value we have examined. Hedonism would reduce aesthetic value to the pleasure the artwork produces, but that misses the sense of recognition and demand. A person can recognize that a piece of music is magnificent while finding it personally unpleasant to listen to, if, for example, it is in a genre that grates on their ears. The judgment of greatness and the experience of pleasure can come fully apart. Desire theory fares no better. You do not desire a great painting into existence. The painting's value does not depend on anyone wanting it. A masterwork locked in a vault that no one knows about seems to retain its aesthetic value, even though no desire is directed toward it. Objective list theory can include aesthetic experience on its list, but it cannot explain what makes aesthetic value distinctive. It can say that beauty matters, but it cannot say why a particular arrangement of sounds or colours or words commands attention in the way it does. The value seems to emerge from the specific configuration of the object itself, not from its membership in a general category of goods. The philosopher Frank Sibley argued that aesthetic properties like elegance, grace and garishness are genuinely perceived in objects, but cannot be reduced to non-aesthetic physical descriptions. No list of physical measurements of a painting, its dimensions, the chemical composition of its pigments, the wavelengths of reflected light will tell you whether it is graceful or clumsy. Aesthetic properties emerge from physical properties but are not reducible to them. This echoes More's claim about goodness being unanalyzable. But in the aesthetic domain, the point is even harder to resist, because aesthetic perception is so clearly tied to specific sensory encounters. A contemporary debate in aesthetics sharpens this further. Is the value of art in the experience it produces, or in the object itself? If a perfect forgery of a Vermeer painting produces exactly the same visual experience as the original, is it equally valuable? Most people say no, and the reason connects back to the experience machine. We value the real Vermeer partly because a particular human being in 17th century Delft actually made specific choices with specific pigments in response to specific conditions of light. The history is part of the value, and a perfect copy with a different history is a different thing, aesthetically speaking. Aesthetic value thus reveals something about value in general that moral philosophy sometimes obscures. Not all value is fungible, replaceable with equivalent substitutes. Some value is constitutively tied to particular objects, particular histories, and particular acts of creation. This insight will return when we consider the value of nature and the shape of a whole life. Part 17. Epistemic value. There is another domain of value that operates alongside the moral and the aesthetic, but follows its own distinctive logic: the value of knowledge and true belief. Epistemic value concerns what makes some beliefs better than others, and why having accurate beliefs matters. The straightforward answer is that true beliefs are instrumentally valuable. They help you navigate the world effectively. A surgeon who has true beliefs about anatomy performs better than one with false beliefs. A pilot with accurate information about weather conditions is more likely to land safely. On this view, truth is valuable the way a reliable map is valuable. Useful because it gets you where you want to go. But this cannot be the whole story, because we value truth even when it has no practical payoff. Consider a historian studying a minor trade route used in the 14th century. The facts she uncovers will not cure any disease, improve any technology, or change any policy. They have no foreseeable instrumental value at all. Yet she and her colleagues treat the accuracy of her findings as mattering enormously, and that treatment does not seem confused. They care about getting it right for its own sake. This suggests that truth has final value, not just instrumental value. We pursue accuracy not only because of what it gets us, but because knowing the truth is itself a good. This claim is embedded in every academic institution, every journalistic standard, every legal proceeding that privileges evidence over speculation. The commitment to truth runs deeper than any particular use to which truth is put. But the claim that truth is finally valuable faces a challenge that parallels the experience machine. The philosopher Jonathan Quanvig posed a question that has driven much of recent epistemology. Why is knowledge more valuable than mere true belief? If you believe correctly that it is raining and your belief was formed by a reliable but accidental process, you have a true belief. If you believe it is raining because you looked out the window, you also have a true belief. But this one counts as knowledge because it was formed through a reliable and appropriate connection to the fact. Both beliefs have the same content and the same truth value. So why do we value the second one more? This is sometimes called the value problem in epistemology, or the Meno problem, after a dialogue by Plato in which Socrates raises a similar puzzle. Plato's answer was that knowledge is more valuable than true belief because knowledge is tied down by reasons, the way a statue is tied to its pedestal. A true belief without reasons can blow away. Knowledge stays put. But this answer only pushes the question back. Why is being tied down by reasons valuable? One answer connects epistemic value directly to broader axiological concerns. If truth is a constituent of human flourishing, as the objectivist theorist claims, then knowledge, properly grounded true belief, contributes to flourishing in a way that accidentally true belief does not. The person with knowledge has a genuine cognitive achievement, a real relationship to reality that makes her life go better. The person with merely true belief has a lucky correspondence that could dissolve at any moment. This matters practically in an era of algorithmically curated information. A person who believes a true claim because a social media algorithm served it to them might have the same belief content as a person who investigated the evidence directly. But the first person's relationship to the truth is fragile and accidental, while the second person's is robust and earned. If epistemic value is about the quality of one's connection to reality and not just the content of one's beliefs, then how we come to hold beliefs matters as much as whether those beliefs are correct. Epistemic value also intersects with moral value in ways that are not always comfortable. The truth sometimes hurts, and the pursuit of truth sometimes conflicts with other goods like kindness, social harmony, or personal well-being. A doctor who tells a terminally ill patient the full statistical details of their prognosis may be honouring truth while causing significant suffering. An axiological framework that includes both truth and well-being must grapple with the possibility that they can pull in opposite directions, and there is no guaranteed resolution. Part 18. The Value of Nature. A river runs through a remote valley that no human has ever visited, and no human is likely to visit. A mining operation upstream begins contaminating the water, killing the fish, dissolving the riverbank ecosystem, and turning the water opaque. No human is harmed. No human even knows about it. Is something of value being destroyed? If you answer yes, you have committed yourself to a claim that challenges the foundations of nearly every axiological theory we have considered. Because every theory so far has grounded value ultimately in the experience, desires, or flourishing of conscious subjects, specifically human ones. A river that no one experiences, that no one desires, and that contributes to no human being's flourishing does not register on any of those frameworks. Yet the intuition that something wrong is happening when the river is destroyed is widely shared and deeply felt. The philosopher Holmes Rollston III argued that nature has intrinsic value independent of any human valuer. Ecosystems, species, and natural processes carry value in themselves, not because of what they do for us. A species that goes extinct is a loss even if no human ever studied it, admired it, or depended on it. The loss is in the thing itself, not in the gap it leaves in human experience. This is a strong claim, and the arguments against it are formidable. The most direct objection is that value requires a valuer. A universe with no conscious beings in it would contain rocks and gases and radiation, but it would not contain goodness or badness. These are categories that only arise when there is a perspective from which things can matter, and perspectives require minds. On this view, saying the river has value independent of any mind is like saying the river has meaning independent of any language. It confuses a property of the relationship between subject and world with a property of the world alone. But the defender of natural value can push back. Consider the claim that a healthy ecosystem is objectively more complex, more integrated, and more self-sustaining than a degraded one. These are not subjective assessments. They are measurable properties of the system. If we already grant that complexity, integration, and self-sustenance are features of the world, the further step of calling them valuable may not require importing a subjective perspective at all. It may only require recognizing that certain configurations of matter are doing something that others are not, and that the doing matters. The philosopher Ananias built an entire ethical framework, deep ecology, around the claim that all living beings have inherent worth. On his view, the conventional approach to environmental protection, which values nature only for its usefulness to humans, is not just morally insufficient, but conceptually confused. It treats humans as the measure of all value and everything else as instrumental. Nias argued that this anthropocentrism is a bias as unjustified as the geocentrism that once placed Earth at the center of the cosmos. The practical implications of this debate are significant. If nature has only instrumental value, then environmental policy is fundamentally a calculation about human welfare. How much wilderness do we need to maintain clean air, clean water, flood control, and recreation? If nature has intrinsic value, then the calculation changes dramatically. We would need to weigh human development against the inherent worth of ecosystems, and the ecosystems might sometimes win, even when no human benefit is at stake. This question has become increasingly urgent as extinction rates accelerate and as artificial intelligence and synthetic biology open the possibility of creating functional substitutes for natural systems. If an engineered ecosystem provides all the same services as a natural one, is anything of value lost when the original is destroyed? The answer depends entirely on whether you think the value of nature resides in its functions, which can be replicated, or in its particular history and being, which cannot. Part 19. Sacred and Profane. Some things resist valuation altogether, not because their value is uncertain, but because the very act of assigning them a value feels like a violation. A parent is offered $10 million in exchange for their child. The parent does not deliberate about whether the price is high enough. They do not counter-offer. They feel something closer to offence at the question itself. The offer is not merely refused, it is treated as a category mistake, like being asked the colour of a number. Children are not the kind of thing that can be priced, and treating them as if they were is already a failure of understanding. The philosopher Michael Sandel has documented the expansion of market logic into domains where it triggers exactly this kind of resistance. Companies that pay citizens to accept toxic waste facilities near their homes. Schools that pay children to read books. Countries that allow wealthy foreigners to buy citizenship. In each case, introducing a price does not merely adjust the allocation of the good, it changes the character of the good itself. Sandel argues that some goods are corrupted by being bought and sold. A civic award given for heroism has a certain kind of value. The same award, purchased for a fee, has a completely different character. The monetary transaction does not just redistribute the award, it transforms what the award means, and thereby what it is worth. The corruption is not a side effect of the transaction, but constitutive of it. This connects to the concept of incommensurability from Part 11, but pushes it further. Incommensurability says that some values cannot be measured on a common scale. But what we are encountering now is something stronger, the claim that some things should not even be subjected to the attempt. The very process of comparison degrades the thing being compared. The economist and philosopher Elizabeth Anderson addressed this through her concept of protected values. Certain goods occupy a status in our evaluative framework that is categorically above trade-off. Human dignity, bodily integrity, sacred sites, and certain bonds of loyalty are treated as having what Anderson called a higher evaluative mode. To treat them as commensurable with ordinary goods is not just to undervalue them, but to misunderstand what kind of thing they are. The philosopher Joseph Raz made a related argument about the nature of constitutive goods. Some goods are not just instrumentally valuable for the goals they serve. They partly constitute the relationships or practices they belong to. Friendship is not a means to some further end that could in principle be served by other means. The specific acts of loyalty, trust and attention that make up a friendship are not separable from the friendship itself. Trying to replace those acts with efficient substitutes would not optimize the friendship, it would destroy it. The resistance to pricing sacred things is not irrational sentimentality. It reflects a deep structural feature of value that aggregation-based frameworks systematically miss. Some values function as framework values, establishing the conditions under which other values make sense. Human dignity is not one good among others, to be weighed against economic efficiency. It is a precondition for the whole evaluative practice of weighing goods at all. If you sacrifice dignity for efficiency, you have not made a trade-off within the system. You have undermined the system itself. But here is the unsolved problem. If some values truly are beyond comparison, how do we handle genuine conflicts between sacred goods? When the bodily integrity of a pregnant woman conflicts with the life of an unborn child, both parties may invoke protected values. When religious freedom conflicts with equal treatment, both claims may be constitutive of their respective frameworks. Treating any value as absolutely beyond trade-off risks paralysis in exactly the cases where action is most needed. The sacredness of certain values may be real, but how to navigate a world with multiple competing sacred claims remains one of the deepest unresolved tensions in all of axiology. Part 20. The Shape of a Life. Every theory of value we have examined so far evaluates a life by looking at its contents. How much pleasure it contains, how many desires are satisfied, how many goods from the list are present. But there is a feature of a life that none of these approaches capture, and it is one that almost everyone cares about deeply. A life is not just a collection of moments. It has a shape, a narrative arc, a trajectory that goes somewhere over time. Consider two lives with identical total contents. Both contain the same amount of pleasure, the same achievements, the same relationships, the same knowledge. But in the first life, things start badly and get steadily better. Early hardship gives way to growing competence, deepening relationships, and eventually a period of mastery and fulfillment. In the second life, things start magnificently and decline. Early brilliance fades into loss, isolation, and diminishment. Most people judge the first life as better, even though the total contents are the same. The upward trajectory, the story of overcoming and growth, adds something that the mere sum of moments misses. The philosopher David Velleman argued that this reveals a fundamental inadequacy in additive theories of well-being. If the value of a life were just the sum of the values of its parts, the two lives would be equal. But they are not equal, because the order matters. A life is not a set, it is a sequence, and the shape of the sequence is itself a carrier of value. This insight connects to how people actually evaluate their own lives in hindsight. A retired teacher, reflecting on a career of modest accomplishments and steady dedication, might judge her life as deeply worthwhile, not because any individual year was spectacular, but because the whole thing holds together as a story of commitment and purpose. A former prodigy who burned out at 30 might report more total peak experiences but judge his life as a failed one. The narrative structure, the relationship between chapters, is doing the evaluative work. The philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre pushed this idea further by arguing that human life is fundamentally narrative in structure. We are not isolated decision-makers optimizing moment by moment. We are characters in ongoing stories, stories shaped by traditions, communities, and roles that we inherit and to which we contribute. To ask whether a life is good is to ask whether it makes sense as a story, whether its parts cohere into a meaningful whole. This narrative dimension of value has practical implications for how we make decisions. A person choosing between two career paths is not just comparing the expected utilities of two options. She is choosing between two possible stories about who she will become. The cellist from Part 11 is not weighing career satisfaction against filial duty in the abstract. She is deciding which story she can live with, which narrative she can own as genuinely hers. But narrative value has its own problems. Not every life lends itself to a coherent story, and insisting that it should can be oppressive. People who suffer from chronic illness, who face repeated disruption, or who live in conditions of extreme instability may not have lives that form a satisfying arc. If the shape of a life is a genuine value, then people in chaotic circumstances are not just unlucky. They are missing something that contributes to a life going well. That conclusion might be true, but it risks adding insult to injury, blaming the structure of a life for failures that are imposed from outside. There is also a question about who gets to tell the story. A person's own narrative of their life and the narrative others would construct from the same events can diverge radically. Is the shape of a life determined by the person living it, or by some more objective assessment of how the events fit together? This question has no settled answer, and it brings us back to the tension between subjective and objective accounts of value that has run through every part of this inquiry. Part 21. Meaning beyond morality. There is a category of value that people care about intensely, but that does not reduce to any of the types we have discussed. Meaning. When people say they want their lives to be meaningful, they are not just saying they want pleasure, desire, satisfaction, or even a well-shaped narrative. They are pointing to something else, something that has to do with a connection between their individual existence and something larger. The philosopher Susan Wolf identified this gap in a landmark essay and book. She argued that meaning in life arises from active engagement with projects of objective worth. Both elements are necessary. A person who is deeply engaged with something worthless, say obsessively counting the cars that pass on a particular highway, has engagement without worth. A person who contributes to a genuinely important cause but feels no personal connection to it, going through the motions with complete detachment, has worth without engagement. Meaning requires both, and the combination generates a kind of value that is irreducible to either component. Wolf's formula, active engagement with objectively worthwhile projects, captures something about the lives we most admire. The scientist who devotes decades to understanding a disease, the teacher who transforms the lives of students in an underserved school, the artist who pushes a medium into new territory at great personal cost. In each case, the person is connected to something beyond their own satisfaction, and that connection is not just instrumentally valuable. It is constitutive of what makes the life meaningful. But the phrase objectively worthwhile does the controversial work. Who decides which projects are objectively worthwhile and which are not? Wolf is explicit that the standard is not subjective. A person who feels deeply engaged with a trivial or destructive project does not thereby have a meaningful life. But she is also not offering a fixed list. She appeals to a kind of intersubjective judgment, the considered assessment of thoughtful people, while acknowledging that this standard is itself imperfect and revisable. Meaning also differs from moral value in a crucial respect. A morally exemplary person who never finds anything to be personally engaged with might live a dutiful but meaningless life. And a person engaged with a morally neutral project, building a beautiful garden, perfecting a craft, raising a family with extraordinary care, might have a deeply meaningful life without doing anything that counts as heroically moral. Meaning and morality overlap, but are not the same thing, and a complete axiology must account for both. The existentialist tradition pushed the question of meaning in a more radical direction. The philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus, writing in the mid-20th century, started from the premise that the universe itself provides no meaning at all. There is no cosmic plan, no built-in purpose, no story the universe is telling. Human beings arrive in a world that is indifferent to their existence and must create meaning through their own choices and commitments. On this view, the question is not what is the meaning of life, as if meaning were a fact to be discovered. The question is, what meaning will you make? And the answer is inseparable from the freedom and responsibility of the one who gives it. Camus argued that the fundamental philosophical question is whether life is worth living in a universe without inherent purpose. His answer was yes, but the yes required a specific kind of defiance, the refusal to pretend that meaning comes from outside when it does not, combined with the determination to live fully in spite of that absence. Whether meaning is discovered or created is itself one of the deepest axiological questions. If meaning is entirely constructed, then any construction might be as good as any other, and the concept loses its force. If meaning is entirely objective, then the subjective engagement Woolf identified becomes irrelevant, and meaning becomes just another item on the objective list. The most plausible view may be that meaning requires both an objective component and a subjective one, and that neither alone is sufficient. But saying that both are required does not tell us how they combine or what to do when they conflict. Part 22. What remains open? We have now moved through the full architecture of axiology, from the simplest theory of value to the deepest unresolved tensions. What remains is not a summary, but an honest accounting of what has not been settled. The three classical theories of well-being, hedonism, desire satisfaction, and objective list, each capture something real and each fail in specific identifiable ways. No hybrid theory has yet succeeded in combining their strengths without inheriting their weaknesses. Whether such a synthesis is possible, or whether the theories are tracking fundamentally different aspects of well-being that resist unification, is an open question. The metaethical foundations remain fractured. Constructivists, error theorists, and moral realists disagree not just about which values are correct, but about whether value claims can be true at all, and what it would mean for them to be true. The is-ought gap has not been bridged in a way that commands consensus. Moore's open question, in one form or another, still haunts every attempt to define goodness in natural terms. The question of measurement and aggregation is practically urgent and theoretically unresolved. Every society must make allocation decisions that implicitly aggregate incommensurable values, and no existing framework does this without smuggling in contestable assumptions. The quality-adjusted life year, the cost-benefit analysis, the revealed preference model all provide useful approximations while concealing the axiological choices embedded in their structure. Value pluralism has won significant ground against monism, but it brings its own unresolved problems. If values are genuinely plural and sometimes incommensurable, the dream of a complete rational decision procedure for all evaluative questions is unrealizable. Practical wisdom, judgment, and tolerance of irreducible loss may be the best we can do. Whether that is enough to ground political institutions and shared social life is a question that connects axiology directly to political philosophy. The domains of aesthetic, epistemic, and environmental value each raise distinctive puzzles that moral philosophy alone cannot answer. Beauty behaves differently from goodness. Truth has its own authority, its own mode of mattering. Nature may have a kind of value that no human-centered framework captures. A complete axiology would need to account for all of these domains while explaining how they relate to each other and what to do when they conflict. The question of meaning stands alongside but distinct from the question of moral value, and no existing theory integrates them fully. People can live morally exemplary lives that feel meaningless, and meaningful lives that are morally flawed. How these two kinds of value relate, whether one is more fundamental, whether they can be unified, or whether they represent permanent axes of evaluation that will always pull in partially independent directions, remains genuinely open. And behind all of these specific questions sits the largest one. Is the concept of value itself a human construction projected onto an indifferent universe, or does it name something real about the structure of things? The error theorist says we are all speaking a false language. The realist says we are tracking features of reality that exist whether we notice them or not. The constructivist says we are building something real through the activity of reasoning, something that was not there before we started, but is genuinely there now. None of these positions has won. Each captures something about our experience of value that the others miss. And the fact that the debate continues, with brilliant people on every side, is itself evidence of something. Either the question of what matters is so hard that millennia of effort have not cracked it, or the question itself is structured in a way that resists final resolution, because value is the kind of thing that different aspects of reality reveal differently to different kinds of inquiry. What is not in question is that you are already embedded in this problem. Every choice you make, every institution you participate in, every judgment you pass about, better and worse, is an axiological act. The question is not whether you have a theory of value. You do. The question is whether the one you have can survive the scrutiny it deserves.